Rating agencies are calling Union Budget 2012 a bit of a macro disappointment, and they clearly are of the view that the Union Budget has done precious little to repair India's fiscal situation. So how are rating agencies likely to react in near future? Thoughts on that from Asti Said, Vice President with the Sovereign Risk Group, represents Moody's. Asti, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Why is the budget or the Union Budget 2012 more like a negative budget, and do you think it has disappointed you at the macro front?
One of the things that we had pointed to even before the budget was announced was that India's fiscal deficit suffers from two major constraints. The first one is that the revenue stream for India's government tends to be fairly volatile, which means that when growth slides just a little bit, revenues tend to slide quite a bit. And this is because revenues rely largely on consumption taxes and corporate taxes, which are, of course, very elastic to movements in growth. So that's one aspect of the deficit that we'd highlighted. The second aspect of the deficit was that it is very vulnerable to both commodity price volatility as well as exchange rate volatility. And indeed, in 2011 and 2012, both these came together. Commodity prices remained high, which meant that food, fertilizer, and especially fuel subsidies were larger than the government had budgeted. And the exchange rate depreciated almost 20% over the course of the year, which meant that the price that the government was paying for its subsidies also rose consequently. And these are two things that we don't believe the current budget addresses. However, I should point out that it's not something that we expect one particular budget to solve. India's fiscal problems are entrenched, and they're quite long-term in nature, and we believe fiscal consolidation will also take place over the medium to long term rather than in one budget.
I'd say hi, morning. So although the budget itself lacked new solutions to address fiscal constraints, but these can still be done outside the budget ambit, right? I mean, like a partial decontrol of diesel and fertilizer subsidies. What are your thoughts on that?
We would absolutely agree that the budget is just one policy document that the government puts out during the year. It's an important one because it tells you what the government's fiscal priorities are, but it's by no means the only policy proposal the government has at its disposal. And we do indeed expect that there are several avenues that the government could pursue over the course of the year, indeed over the course of several years, to attempt consolidation. As you pointed out, decontrol or at least deregulation of fuel prices to some extent would be a step in that direction. There are also two other policy proposals that have been on the agenda for a long time. One is the direct tax code, and the other is the goods and services tax. Both of these have been on the agenda for a long time, and it is likely that they'll be implemented. The timing is not clear, but again, these could be implemented even outside the ambit of the budget.
Firstly, do you think that that a possibility of hardening commodity prices could put further pressure on the fiscal position?
Certainly, we've pointed out before that the fiscal position is vulnerable to commodity price increases, and we have seen that the expenditure on subsidies has risen as commodity prices have risen, and these commodities include inputs into fertilizer production as well as food prices, that's a soft commodity, as well as, of course, fuel prices. So we do expect that as commodity prices rise, that would put pressure on the fiscal position. However, I think this is something that the government recognizes, and indeed it started taking steps to reduce its subsidy burden, first in 2010 with what it did on petrol prices, and now the discussion, of course, revolves around LNG and diesel prices. So it is possible that fuel prices could rise, commodity prices could rise, but if the government took steps to amend its subsidy policy, the fiscal deficit doesn't necessarily have to go up with it.
So, Atsi, what's your view on the government borrowing program? Do you think it is inflationary in the near term, and hence, what is your view on the RBI cutting interest rates during FY13?
I believe the RBI itself has been fairly clear about this. They've maintained that the fiscal deficit does fuel inflationary pressures, and we've seen this happen over the last few years, that as the fiscal deficit widened, you saw inflationary pressures take hold in the economy. And this certainly constrains interest rate actions on the part of the RBI. But note that compared to the FY 11-12 budget deficit, 5.1% of GDP actually marks somewhat of a consolidation. So the budget deficit is going from 5.9 to 5.1% of GDP, a modest narrowing, but a narrowing nonetheless. And commodity prices, particularly food prices, seem to have come off their peaks of last year. So these are two fairly benign trends that perhaps will help inflationary pressures come off last year's high. In addition, of course, there's the arithmetics of inflation. Since inflation was very high last year, the arithmetic hurdle to it becoming even higher this year is high. And all these three things combined, we think, will keep inflation within the government's and the RBI's target range, which is around 7% for this year. And this perhaps, given that growth has slowed down considerably, could give some room for interest rate cuts. But as I said before, and as the RBI has indeed said before, that wide fiscal deficits constrain interest rate policy.
And Asli, finally, what is your view on rupee depreciation? Do you think it will continue to hamper capital inflows in India?
The two are very interlinked, and in India's case, the oil price movement tends to play a big role in its current account deficit, which in turn plays a role on the exchange rate. And coupled with that, the global environment, whether there's risk aversion in general related to factors either India-specific or more global, that too tends to affect the rupee because, of course, India is a capital importing economy. So in that sense, we do believe that the two are interlinked. And last year, we certainly saw that correlation play out, that you saw capital flows either moderate or even outflows in some period, and that affected the exchange rate and vice versa. That has improved a little bit in the first part of this year, and how it plays out over the rest of 2012 will depend again on the two things, which is oil prices as well as global risk aversion.